All right. Well, if you'll just start us off with just giving your name and titles.
So my name is Ben Campbell. My current title is Pastoral Associate at St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Richmond. And I'm a Pastor Emeritus of Richmond Hill Monastery Retreat Center in Richmond.
Great. Great. Well, and I want to say while it's recording too, thank you so much for taking your time to talk to us a little bit today. This program kind of in honor of Reverend L. Francis Griffin, who was local pastor here in Farmville, but also very, very civic engagement minded, very much social justice kind of oriented. And I think you are in a powerful position to speak to some of that kind of in a contemporary sense, just given the work that you do. But if you wouldn't mind just starting off, just telling us a little bit about your background, where you're from, and kind of what led you to be called to the ministry.
Well, I was born in Arlington, Virginia. My dad's a sixth generation Virginian. His family was from Lexington. His dad was the dean of Washington and Lee University, and his grandfather was a professor at Washington College when Lee became the president of Washington College in Lexington. And before that, the family had helped to start that Presbyterian institution actually in 1782. So they were Valley Scots Virginians and grew up in that area. My dad was an attorney in DC and Northern Virginia. He ended up taking two very critical civil rights cases in Virginia in the 50s and early 60s as an opponent of the Byrd machine in the state. And I grew up with his politics on the one hand. We lived across the street from the Washington Golf and Country Club, but we were probably the only white people who were not permitted to join because he had made some public statements that the board disapproved of. And my mother was the daughter of a Moravian bishop from Winston-Salem, North Carolina, and she was then an educator and actually was the first woman elected to a school board in Virginia. Arlington had an elected school board that they got permission from the state to do in 1948. And in 1956, as chair of the school board, she and the school board decided to voluntarily integrate the Arlington Public Schools. That was not popular with the Byrd machine. It was a voluntary thing, did not come from the courts. So they really did not like that. So they summoned her to Richmond, put her before a committee, interrogated her, and then passed a law getting rid of the Arlington School Board. So that was my childhood. And it was between religion and a kind of and politics and law, but my father was a great believer in the principles that were stated in the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights, which obviously people who stated them didn't fully believe in, but he did. I found these two things were very close to each other in my own heart, and I couldn't understand race in Virginia. It didn't make any sense to worship Jesus, who clearly treated every human being as of great value, to say you believed in the Constitution and Declaration of Independence, and at the same time practice this really strange, and because Virginia education was quite restricted, strange and inexplicable discrimination. And it really weighed on me, I know, in my heart. As a boy, this is just basically the development of white boy in a mostly white environment. As a boy, I was aware that if anyone was excluded from rights or from God's love, that meant I could be. It was either all of us or none of us. And the good news is all of us. The bad news would be none of us. So here we are looking for something to base our lives on. My call was confusing to me. I went to public high school, did 4 years of political science and political economy at Williams College in Massachusetts, did 3 years of theology at Oxford University in England, and came back, did 2 years at Virginia Theological Seminary in Alexandria to become an Episcopal priest, and still quite confused. And I would say my call was not clear to me till 10 years after I was ordained. I started in the northern neck of Virginia in the last 2 years of school segregation there. Actually got in a lot of trouble, and but managed to come to Richmond, moved to Churchill, and lived there for 47 years till I just moved 3 years ago from Richmond Hill, which was the retreat center and community I lived in. So that's my background. I decided after doing 8 years of public relations and news work for the Episcopal Bishop of Virginia in Richmond, I decided I wanted to work in community affairs and race relations, and there were no effective jobs in the Episcopal Church doing that. No parishes were paying somebody to do that. But I also felt that if I was going to do interracial work, the issue was power and equity, and the Episcopal Church was so white that there was no way of having a sense of power and equity to start from. And so I helped to start an operation called the Richmond Urban Institute, which we started at the same time that Richmond got its first Black mayor in the history of the Confederacy, which is pretty amazing. And we deliberately started an organization that was half Black and half white. Went on from there because somehow, we have to build a world together. As you know, whereas Robert Taylor was the great dean of the clergy of Richmond for years and years and was critical to the whole civil rights revolution here in the city. And Dr. Taylor, who was one of the people who helped start Richmond Hill when I joined it and whom I worked with in Churchill over the years, Dr. Taylor used to say that in Richmond, organizations were either Black or white, and that our goal was to try to find an organization that was both. And that's very hard to do because either the Black people think you're too white or the white people think you're too Black, and you never get where you need to get. So that's the kind of work I got engaged in, and worked in community organizing, helped to start a housing renovation program in Churchill to try to help beat gentrification and enable people to buy houses in the neighborhood who had been renters. It was a very, very difficult task and not a very successful one, I'm afraid. And then I also worked extensively with public education, helped to start a group called the Micah Association, which ended up having 130 faith communities related to 24 inner city elementary schools, providing volunteers and support. And then I also worked for 19 years with 2 programs at Armstrong High School, which is one of the most severely impacted high schools in the state of Virginia. It has 5 public housing projects feeding into it, but of course was one of the first all-Black high schools in the state of Virginia, starting, I believe, in 1866 or 67. It was very early and important school and has a lot of great graduates. But today it's completely segregated, more than it was 50 years ago, and is segregated by income as well as by race, which creates a severe thing. So a bunch of clergy in Churchill and some former educators started a freshman academy there to see what we could do if we could get some more private money supporting the work in the school. And we also have a leadership program there, which graduates about 12 or 13 kids a year, has about 40 kids working with it. And we graduate 100% of our kids, which in a school that's graduating, 60% or so, that's pretty amazing. And everybody goes to something, to college or the Marine Corps or junior college or a training program. And we've learned a tremendous amount. Basically, it's not impossible for anybody, but you need resources, you need attention, and basically the resources are not provided. This starting of the Armstrong Freshman Academy was a fascinating thing. I will never forget a meeting I was in with the principal of the school and some members of the school board and a bunch of clergy. And Dr. Sylvester Smith, who's a really beautiful man, he actually was a high school math teacher before he became ordained, and he now is pastor of Good Shepherd Baptist in Churchill and also teaches at STVU, School of Theology at Virginia Union. And Dr. Smith said one day, he said, I think whether these kids graduate from high school and are able to do something is just about as important as whether or not they come to church. And I just loved it because that's the way I feel. God is interested in the success of human beings. And our ability to function well. The church is a secondary entity. And if it serves that purpose, That is, if in fact it is willing to take low and be second, it can actually be a great help and service to the community. If it considers itself top dog, the most important thing, then it wastes everybody's time and diverts attention from the divine intentions of the world. I see nothing in the scripture that suggests to me that either the Old Testament prophets or Jesus himself thought that church was the most important thing there is. But boy, you sure would think that's the thing they said right out of the gate. I've had a great time living and working in the city of Richmond, which I think is a very special place, trying to understand what God wants of us. And I've believed, because I guess it's kind of what happened to me as a person, I have believed that in Virginia, the issue of race is inseparable from the gospel.
This notion of it's either all of us or none of us, in terms of salvation or, blessings and such, like that's such a profile. Like as soon as I talked to you, like over the phone previously, like I knew instantly, like yeah, he gets it. he gets it. But so many people don't, and then I know some of that is willing, I know some of that is ignorance, but was there, I guess I'm curious, was there a moment that you kind of, something like clicked, or did when segregation era, like was there there's a moment that that all people weren't treated equally or equitably, and then what kind of, I guess, if there's a defining event or moment that happened? I was curious.
Yeah, I honestly, I really don't know. I know that I emerged, first place I really grew up white, in Arlington County. I grew up in segregated schools. The only African-American people I knew were working in the household, in my household or other people's households. I mean, it really was the old South, even though it was Northern Virginia at that time. My parents, liberal white Southerners are tough people because they don't, they're not beat up by black people, they're beat up by white people. Of course, black people understand what it is to be beat up by white people. Well, I mean, they really don't like us. And so there's a lot of abuse that occurs. And these two were pretty tough people. They must have done their own things, but they too were very isolated. They did not have significant interracial peer relationships. But I ended up in a quest, trying to meet people I didn't know, trying to understand things I didn't understand. I worked in Southwest DC when it was a redevelopment project. I went and worked on an Indian reservation. I lived overseas and began to see that begin to understand other people who were not the same as me. But the really powerful changes for me occurred when I lived in Church Hill and got engaged in the community, and I was the only white person in a number of black environments. And I began to get some feeling to support what it was I believed. It was such a privilege. I mean, most white people don't have that privilege. Most white people basically are never in a minority. So black people are just dark white people to them, and they're trying to understand that. And you just can't get there from there. It doesn't happen. You never get there. And the other thing about being white, which I think is really important to understand, and I wrestle with this every day, is that we really grew up thinking being white was normal, and other people, had to think about race. You're either a person or you're black or you're Latino. So it's normal and then exception. And that is the way. So how could you say all men are created equal and not consciously know that you're excluding somebody? You don't have to say all white men are created equal, because that's what you're assuming when you say it. So can I tell you another story? So I'm pastoral director. I am an associate pastor at St. Paul's Church in Richmond. St. Paul's is next to the Capitol, just on the western side of the Capitol. And the history of St. Paul's is this. In 1788, St. John's Church in Church Hill was across a muddy valley from the city that was growing with all these impressive people, Madison, Monroe, George Wythe, the people who helped to write the Constitution, John Marshall, they're all there in Richmond. But they're not going to go across a muddy valley to church. It's a half-hour drive in a carriage. It's just too much. So the Capitol was built in 1788, and remember the Constitution is being ratified at the same time. It's a pretty important moment. And starting right then, the Episcopal priest and the Presbyterian minister, both white, start a Sunday service at the Capitol. And every Sunday at the Capitol from 1788 to 1814, the gentry who are running Virginia gather for church. Every governor, everybody who's a politician, all the lawyers, they all go there for church. They've been at a barbecue out at a spring the day before, drinking juleps and all that stuff, which is the other thing they all did together with the Presbyterian and the Episcopal minister. But on Sunday, they're in the Capitol. There's a great fire called the Richmond Theater Fire in 1811. And they decide to build a memorial church called Monumental Church. It's on Broad Street. And in 1814, the Capitol congregation ends, and the Episcopalians in it go to Monumental Church, 1814. So they are there until 1841. In 1841, right across the street from Monumental Church, the First Baptist Church, which is the white Baptist church in Richmond, sells its building to the black members of its congregation. And so in 1841, First African Baptist Church begins about 50 yards from the entry to this monumental Episcopal church. So every Sunday, beginning in 1841, in the street outside of the monumental church, you have two things happening. You have 2,000 African Americans gathering, and you have 125 Episcopalians being driven to Monumental Church in their carriages by persons who, if they can, will get out of the carriage and go over to First African Baptist. In 1841, Monumental's entire congregation and clergy person decide to move to the west side of the Capitol, buy a piece of land on the other side of the Capitol and move their church up there. And that's St. Paul's Church. I think it's a fascinating story. Nobody says why they moved. I think I know why they moved, but they'll never say that. And that's part of the theme here, because what happens is by 1841, the largest slave market on the East Coast has developed 3 blocks away from Monumental Church in the bottom, just on the other side of the Capitol from St. Paul's. We have just had 3 professional historians, and I've also been a part of it, working on the history of St. Paul's for the last 2 years. And looking at the members who are a lot of the owners and people running companies in Richmond. And not one time does anybody mention anything that suggests that 35,000 people a year are being sold 4 blocks away, that the largest piece of the Richmond economy, probably more than 50% of it, is involved in the slave trade. And that is the only way, in fact, that Richmond is staying economically viable. And it is never discussed. It is never referred to. That is a long way of saying, and then, by the way, it's not discovered historically in Richmond until 2000, 135 years later. It's a long way of saying that we're not just dealing with overt prejudice. What we're dealing with is a history of denial that is so profound that you can see the world as if you're white, as if anybody who's not white is a footnote to your life. The person who's not white experiences it quite differently. And, I'm not the one who can tell you that, although I've been told that, plenty of times now. But that is the strangeness of Virginia. And that's the task that God sets before us as white people. And, it's one of the reasons that uh, folks such as you have to spend a whole lot of time explaining stuff to white people because they really don't know. It is so bizarre that they don't.
I think that quote you said earlier, I mean, I'm going to borrow that if that's okay. I mean, you said that, like something to the effect of that white people see black people as just dark white people. And I'm just like,
Right. Yeah.
wow, like that is the perfect way to say that because traditionally white people do not have to have conversations about race, like you kind of have said. And so when you don't have conversations about race, yeah, white is normal and everything else is just other, right? And so it's like you don't,
Well, if we were taught, I mean, and this is another thing it's difficult to understand, but and I bet if you and I went around Farmville right now, we could get this one echoed a whole lot. We were taught, those of us who had, parents who were attempting to deal with race in a less ugly fashion, we were taught that we were not supposed to see any difference. That literally is what we were taught. People just say, everybody's the same. And nobody understood that might be, in some sense, disrespectful, clueless, that you might never understand anything if that's the way you lived. We were taught, in fact, that was the only way to value people equally, was not to notice distinction. And it sounded like a good idea, but it ends up, as you know, in a very, very bad place, and means you exclude what you're experiencing, which is we're different. What a privilege I had to work in a Black Baptist church for 3 years, or to sit in community meetings for 10 years where I was the only white person, and to hear all sorts of negative statements about white people and jokes of that sort, and realize that it wasn't personal. I was sitting with people who knew me and that I knew them, but I could begin to hear different things, and having lived in another country for 3 years, which I did in England, and actually lived in Germany as well. I mean, to use the skills I'd learned of trying to understand difference, for my own country, was really helpful too.
You got it. You got it going on. I think plenty of people need to hear your words, and I mean, I would ditto most of what you said. All of it. I mean, you just the fact that you can exist in culture, just expose yourself to different cultures, right? Which broadens your horizons, and then you can really start to realize that everybody doesn't have the same experience, right? Like the implication that everybody is the same implies that we all have the same experience, which is just not true. So if you don't notice differences in culture or color or race or ethnicity, you don't notice those patterns and who's excluded from the parties and who's being, marginalized at an increased rate. So that's great. You have touched on more points than I even knew I wanted to talk about. I do want to give you a chance to talk about your book a little bit, because I do think that is a great kind of collection of a lot of your thoughts that you talked about here today. Would you mind sharing a little about your book, Richmond's Unhealed History?
Yeah. So Richmond's Unhealed. Can I say something first about Farmville and Moton and that? Yeah. I think it's a terribly important story, and I was at the unveiling of the Barbara Johns Monument in Capitol Square, which was a great moment. But I love her story. I love the fact that you guys were 1/5 of Brown versus Board. That Oliver Hill and our Virginia people actually carried that. And I was dealing with massive resistance at the same time up in Arlington. My dad was taking the Norfolk case, the only case in massive resistance which was brought by a bunch of white people. The white Norfolk businessmen didn't want to lose schools, and they were so enthused at having schools, they were even willing to send their kids to school with black children. And, Virginians, the greatly well-educated Virginians, were willing to close schools, have their kids not go to school, or have at least some kids not go to school, rather than have them integrated, which is just truly bizarre. I mean, it is a truly uneducated point of view, and you're guaranteeing, the uneducation of your future. But the massive resistance events in Virginia were the events of my childhood, and the fight against these people who were being more overt about their racist language than they ever had been. The whole Virginia white thing was not to talk about your racism. That way you could keep it under wraps better, but still do it. They were so proud they weren't like Alabama or Mississippi. But when it came to massive resistance by 1957 and 58, they were all saying it just as loud as they could, and the General Assembly was saying it. Prince Edward County was experiencing it along with all the rest of us. We got rid of massive resistance, and then Prince Edward decided to go on and close the schools anyway. That is just bizarre. So you all had it even 5 years worse than any of the rest. And although I do think the courage and witness of the people of Prince Edward is amazing. And because it attracted national attention and because the story was able to be told, it still is a source of great strength to the rest of us. So I just wanted to say that it means a lot to me, and it means a lot to me to be able to be in conversation with you today, because I do think, only a few miles from Appomattox, we're dealing with this powerful revival of the human spirit and testimony to who we can be and what we want to be. So thank you.
No, the pleasure is all mine, I assure you. I thank you for taking your time.
Yeah. Now, where was I going? You talking about my book. Okay. So what happens to me is I came to Richmond. I tried to live in a house in the fan. I was a priest. I'd come here to work for the Episcopal bishop doing his public relations work. The lady who was renting me the house said to me, we have no pets. And I said, oh gosh, I've got 2 Siamese cats and I just love them. I just got to have them. She said, okay. She said, but you're not going to have any black visitors, are you? Actually, she said colored. You're not going to have any colored visitors, are you? I know you're a clergyman and people are talking about stuff. So I walked out that door and called a friend of mine who had a church in Churchill and moved to Churchill. That's where nobody was going to ask me that question. I couldn't figure out Richmond. I'd never been able to figure it out as a boy. And but I came that it was strangely and puzzlingly dormant, that it seemed unable to move, remember I moved there in the period of time when they were fighting over the annexation of Chesterfield and had just begun to integrate their schools. But I couldn't understand the thing. And I was I'd come to try to help get Richmond's Hill started, and I was standing on the porch one day on Grace Street, and I looked across the street, and this woman was walking with a bunch of high school students. And I went over there, and I said, what's up? And she says, her name was Nancy Jo Taylor. She taught in the Richmond Public Schools. And she said, I am showing these young people the unmarked Black historic sites in the center of Richmond. And I said, huh? What unmarked Black historic sites? And so she gave me a list of them and told me about them. She was an oral historian, and these historic sites were pretty impressive. And they included Lumpkin Slave Jail, which was right at the foot of the hill, along with a number, and the Manchester Docks, which had been a slave port. And so I communicated this to some other people, and we ended up having a history walk in 1993 that Mayor Walter Kenney and 500 other people participated in from across these sites, really the list of sites that Nancy Joe had given me. Then we started a slave trail commission out of that. So I'm becoming aware that there's a history that has not been told. And I was aware that there was something not right. And people kept saying that it was the Civil War, and it didn't feel like the Civil War to me. It felt like something else. And so I began to work with the Slave Trail Commission, and then about 2004, one of the people who we were discussing this whole business, I ran into somebody who said, there was a big slave market here, and nobody knew anything about it. I mean, I'm dealing with all the historians at the universities. I'm talking to anybody in town who knows Richmond history, and nobody knows this stuff. White people don't know it, and Black people don't know it. So here in 2004, this archaeologist from Williamsburg comes to us, to the Slave Trail Commission that I'm on, and says, I know where Lumpkin Slave Jail is. He said, I've been putting GPS maps together. I know where it is. Help me find some money and I'll dig it. So we got him $50,000, and he dug a 48-inch square trench straight down in the middle of Saco Valley, there in a parking lot near Main Street Station. And at the bottom of 10 feet, there is this absolutely pristine cobblestone courtyard, as if somebody had laid it yesterday. And, he's gone through an old steel factory or iron factory and a whole bunch of stuff. All of a sudden, there's this thing. And I go there and I look at that thing and I'm saying, so we went and got him another $500,000. He excavated Lumpkin Slave Jail, which we hope we'll be able to put into a National Slavery Museum, so that people can see the real deal. And then we come to discover this had been the largest slave market on the East Coast, that the downriver slave trade in the second quarter of the 19th century had involved between 1 million and 1.5 million people being sold south to the cotton and sugar plantations. 12 Years a Slave tells a little bit of that if you've seen the movie. But it's there's another book called The Half Has Never Been Told, which is quite helpful on this. But I'm telling you, it's a revelation. Black folks hadn't talked about it. White people, of course, hadn't talked about it. As I told you, I now know that St. Paul's, they didn't put it anywhere between 1840 and 1860 when it was at its height. And so I began to give lectures on this at Richmond Hill, which is the monastery, the community I lived in. I started with 4 lectures, and then I learned more, and they expanded to 6. And by the 4th year, I was into 8 or 9. And I just said, I'm not going to keep doing this. I'm going to publish these. So what it is, and what I came to understand, is that I started telling Richmond's history from about the mid 1500s. Looked at the issues of race and ethnicity from the beginning. Uncovered the what's known as the invention of the white race, which actually occurs first in Maryland law in 1781, and Virginia law in 1689, sorry. And the Virginia slave codes of 1705, where basically race-based slavery is invented. Slavery is already around, but making sure that there's a distinction between a white Negro slave, a white Christian servant, and a Negro slave is written into law. And there are specific privileges given to white Christian servants that are not given to Negro slaves. And you can see the thing developed. So that what happens, and you just start telling the story in a more inclusive fashion. And that's what happened. And I've been doing that ever since. That's what my book is. So it deals with the structures of systemic racism in Virginia, which is our main story. I don't know why people don't tell the story. The other story, of course, is that you had this rather brilliant, strange collection of white plantation owners who collected here by about 1780, who basically invented a Constitution and Declaration of Independence, which have enabled us to help transform the ugliness, although we are not completed. So we had a half revolution in 1776. That's what we had. And, you know, pray God we can complete it. King saw that. King said, you know, bad as it is, I've got these tools that are given me in this country where I can keep trying to make this revolution complete itself. And I got to use them. And he's right. I mean, we know today that, you know, things can be worse. We can lose our government, and we can lose the capacity to change. And we can move back into tyranny, and where we won't be able to change it. Anyway, I published this book about 6 or 7 years ago now. I did it locally because all I wanted to do was to get it out in Richmond and get people reading it. And that's what's happening. Richmond's Unhealed History, Brandy Lane Publishers, Barnes and Noble, Amazon, you know.
Moulton Bookstore once we get it restocked, but it's sold out. I found out we do sell it, but it's been sold out for a while, so we're looking to get some more. Well, I just want to be mindful of your time, but this has been phenomenal. Any parting thoughts you wanted to share, or last kind of thoughts?
Well, I'll do about 3 or 4 minutes on the topic I thought I was talking on. That's all right. Don't worry. We're fine. But no, I wanted to say about why, as a clergyman, and an attempted servant of Jesus Christ, I am in this business. And it has to do with just my understanding. You know, there's this thing that everybody loves to quote, which is John 3, 3:16. God so loved the world that he gave his only son. Yeah, and I think the point there is that God loved the world. And it doesn't say he loved the church. And our business is, you and me and our brothers and sisters, to create a healthy community and a healthy society in which every person counts. The Messiah in Judaism, if you'll look at Psalm 72, the Messiah is seen as the creator of a just society, not some kind of religious functionary. So when they call Jesus the Messiah, they're basically not calling him, you know, another priest. They're basically saying he's going to bring order. He's going to bring respect among human beings. He's going to bring justice, and justice is not about simply who goes to jail and who doesn't. Justice is about proper economic distribution and decent, what we know it to be, decent respect, so that people can live their lives with hope and possibility, and so that the goods and services of the community are shared for the benefit of all. Everybody does their work and everybody receives something. That is very simple. And you know, I do believe that there's a spirit that animates a tremendous number of people. We call it the Holy Spirit, but you don't have to be a Christian to find it as God's Spirit. But you can feel it. People get together and they do good things. They change things. They build reconciliation. They insist on justice. They pay prices for justice. And that's our work. And for 30 years, I worked in nonprofits in the community. And every Friday I'd go in, run a church service at St. Paul's at midday. And I found that I felt much more prayerful doing that than I did when I was working in a church, dealing with all the stuff about choirs and leaflets and power and all that stuff, but which really didn't make much difference. But when I was working in the community, you know, I felt like I was, you know, doing God's work. And so my models for ministry have been the people that I've met who felt, who prayed so hard they were driven to serve, and who served so hard they were driven to pray. And the witness of the civil rights revolution, as particularly the part that was Christian based rather than SNCC and the others, which of course were fine, but that wasn't what I was moved by. But the SCLC, that was a witness that helped form me as a human being, and is part of what drew me into this business. And that's you know, that's what I got called to. So.
Wow, yeah, that was, I think.
I know we're honoring this guy from Farmville today. That's the part of the reason I wanted to say that. I mean, I'm sure that's what he saw. And
Oh, absolutely. And his son, whose interview will release too. I mean, his eldest son, Skip Griffin, or Reverend Griffin Jr.
right,
He said, kind of ideology-wise, he probably would have aligned more with like an SCLC, but just he thought pragmatically the infrastructure that NAACP had just kind of made him more pragmatically draw to them.
right,
Serve as state president for Virginia for a spell, but
yeah.
I think, yeah, no, that's fantastic, and I think that this is going to be great stuff for everybody to hear, and I very much appreciate you taking the time to talk to me today.
Well, thank you for interviewing me, and I'll look forward sometime to seeing you down there. I've never been to Moton, so.
Oh, yeah.
Well,
When things are cleaner, we will have to get you down. Maybe we can do a program or something.
Yeah. Okay.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Townsend.
You have a great day, and I will look forward to talking to you in the future.
You too. Take care.
Thank you.